Good afternoon. It's June 22nd, and this is To My Liberal Friends. Politics can be a funny sport. It can also be one that extracts a bit of retribution on occasion. As most of you know who've been listening to this podcast, I'm not a fan of the Freedom Caucus within the House of Representatives. During the vote to elect the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, they forced over a dozen votes to get him finally elected. In doing so, they attempted to extract concessions from the Speaker to agree to do what they wanted to do, or they would not vote for him. While all this was happening, the Democrats sat back and laughed and kept voting for their leader, Hakeem Jeffries, to be Speaker. Now, of course, they knew there was not a chance of that happening, and eventually Republicans would have to come up with enough votes to elect a Speaker. But it did not speak well for the Republican majority in the House to have to go through that process and put up with the shenanigans of these ultra-right-wing members. Speaker McCarthy and President Biden were finally able to negotiate an agreement that would prevent the United States from defaulting on its debts. Biden had maintained for months that he would not negotiate and would only accept a clean extension of the debt limit. But Speaker McCarthy stuck to his guns and finally forced Joe Biden to come to the negotiating table. The resulting piece of legislation was clearly a win for McCarthy, period. There were a couple of things that Biden got, but the majority of the wins went to McCarthy. One of the most important ones was that Congress would have to pass individual appropriations bills, and no longer will we see massive 4,000-page omnibus bills that nobody's been able to read. Couple that with a more open rule on the House floor where amendments are allowed to be offered, it's a win for both the Republicans and the American people. But this did not sit well with Congressman Chip Roy from Texas and his fellow Freedom Caucus members. They expected those negotiations to produce much deeper cuts in government spending. Now, the problem with that strategy is Republicans would need to have control of the Senate as well as the Oval Office to enact such cuts. They immediately made threats toward the Speaker and actually shut down the floor for a couple of days by refusing to vote for bills being brought forward by the leadership. This forced the Speaker to once again negotiate with these spoiled brats, and the result was they're saying that they would enact deeper cuts in the appropriation process and force the Democrats' hand. Now, anyone that knows anything about how the Congress operates knows that those cuts would be dead on arrival when they arrived in the Senate. Democrats there intend to keep the promise that was made in the deal cut by Biden and McCarthy and keep spending at the lower levels agreed to in those negotiations. That would force the House and Senate to go to conference, and those in the Freedom Caucus have said they would not vote for a final bill unless their cuts are kept in the final package. And that brings us to threatening to shut down the government at the end of the fiscal year. Well, more than 6 months into their majority, different factions of the conference are still figuring out how to work with each other. And we're watching it play out in real time. The tensions they hope to bury after a painful speaker's race are instead being resurrected on everything from looming spending fight to the right flank's impeachment push, which conservative members warn is just the beginning. But moderates in the Republican caucus are fighting back. In a move that completely flew under the radar last week, a group of centrists helped sink amendments to the REINS Act, each aimed at expanding what rules would qualify for congressional scrutiny. From Representative Chip Roy, Bob Good of Virginia, and Andy Biggs from Arizona, they were the sponsors of this bill. These more centrist Republicans are getting tired of the right flank of the party attempting to dictate everything to them. One of these members said, quote, "We're sending a signal," summing up their strategy as an example of how they can hold the far right accountable without negatively affecting leadership. That same member, speaking anonymously, told a reporter that in a previous discussion with Congressman Bob Good, a member of the Freedom Caucus and from Virginia, he told Good, quote, "You want good bills passed, then put another name on it," end quote. The moderates are led by Congressman Dusty Johnson, who chairs the Main Street Caucus, and acknowledged some of his members are willing to play hardball with those on the right. It's a bit of inside baseball. When every bill comes to the House floor, there's a rule which outlines how the bill will be debated and how amendments will be considered. That rule has to be voted on, and normally this is a simple procedure to proceed with consideration of the bill. Some of these moderates are so fed up with the Freedom Caucus that they're considering mimicking the right and simply voting no on the rule, which would bring the floor to a standstill since all Democrats in the minority party vote no. The conflict played out yesterday on the House floor when Congresswoman Lauren Boebert forced a vote on a procedural motion that would impeach President Biden. Even some of her members of the Freedom Caucus felt they were caught off guard, and some were angry at this premature move. The sides ultimately reached an agreement late Wednesday to sidestep an impeachment vote by sending her articles to both the Judiciary and Homeland Security committees, which have jurisdiction over impeachment and immigration policy, respectively. What the Republican majority needs to do is to come to an agreement within the caucus. Issues can be debated actively in the caucus, but once they arrive at a decision, they need to show a unified front. Anything short of this will allow the Democrats, who always vote as one in bloc, to sit back and laugh at Republicans and make them appear to be incapable of governing. And that's not good for the Republican Party. This has been To My Liberal Friends. Thanks for listening. I appreciate any comments you might make.